Is amateur radio under attack? It seems to be, according to a recent YouTube video, which I will link at the end of this video. I urge you to watch that one as well as this one. Both are about the frailties of amateur radio. Amateur radio seems to frequently be under attack. This video revisits an incident back in 1967 where the FCC was actually trying to save amateur radio. As this book, Ham Radio Incentive Licensing Guide by Bert Simon, whose call sign was W2UUN, explained while illustrating that we cannot take our bands for granted. We must stay vigilant. They are a sought-after and limited resource. This book includes the FCC's amendment to Amateur Radio Service Rules, which will provide for an incentive licensing structure. The reasoning for this was because amateur radio was beginning to fade as a viable service. This was brought on by several issues. One, with the creation of the citizen band radio service in 1949, and given the 11-meter band and 23 channels in 1958, it grew rapidly to the point that CB operators outnumbered amateur radio operators 10-2, thus gaining more media coverage and popularity. Number 2, amateur radio operators stagnated due to lack of any stimulation to increase their technological abilities. They were thought of as the last votees of a fading class of once viable techs who were still fiddling with old world surplus equipment and vacuum tubes. 3. Amateur radio also has a public service role, but was losing that image back then. 4. Getting licensed seemed to be a through-the-mail process since 1951. And number 5. Internationally, U.S. amateurs were getting the reputation as the appalling Americans who were overpowered frequency hogs. They had more frequency allocations and were allowed more power output than most other nations. The U.S. amateurs also outnumbered other nations altogether. How incentive licensing might improve U.S. amateur radio. 1. Due to this downgraded image of the U.S. amateur radio service, the FCC attempted to revitalize it by remaking licensing and licensees to be more functional, an aspect that might have more influence at the Geneva Frequency Allocation Conference. This is important. That Geneva Frequency Allocation Conference is also known as WARC. If ham radio isn't worth having, they would just as soon sell off the frequencies and we can go find another hobby. It showed here that the FCC actually cared about us, and I think they still do. 2. There was hope that this incentive licensing might reinvigorate the U.S. amateurs to become better contributors to semiconductor technology and advanced technology in circuit design. 3. The relicensing structure may well remove the through-the-mail process that was looked down upon internationally and domestically. That worries me a little bit because that's kind of what's happening now. You get on the internet, take a test. When I took it, the novice you could take in front of someone who was an extra class license. They got the test in the mail, administered it to you, sent it back. After that, you had to go to an FCC field office to test. It was a bit of a chore. I had to go about 200 miles away to take my other exams. Till later they started coming to ham fests and stuff and testing. And then they got their VEs and VECs to take care of that. Now you do it online. Probably the worst thing that has happened, in my opinion, is the ham cram. That's the worst. You go in there, you come out, you got a license, but you don't know anything. Even with the tests I took, I took the test, I came out of it, I knew a little bit, learned more on the air than I did in the testing. That's kind of the way it's working now, but the ham cram just seems to really take away the knowledge part of the process. What incentive licensing did. Without getting specific, it added a license class and redistributed frequency allocations among the licensees. So the more you knew, the more technological the license was, and the more privileges you got. For details, you can refer to the Radio Licensing Guide. The FCC's amendment to Amateur Radio Service Rules may have saved ham radio back then. I hope that currently it's not needed again. There's other agencies out there that would love our frequencies. It's still to that today. There's competition for those frequencies. And the FCC, with this incentive license, saved us from losing them. Or at least put a big dent in our threat of losing them. So with this in mind, and from what we have seen so far in this, we've got to be diligent. If you like what you heard and you like the channel, it would be nice for you to subscribe. Thank you again for listening, and 73s.